It's not very often that we revisit the Jeep in a video, but I think this one's warranted for a couple of reasons. One, it was kind of glossed over in the initial test drive because we drove several vehicles during that video. And two, this is an LT1. This is a very special Jeep. This Jeep has a 2016 or 17 Gen 5 direct injected LT1 engine with an 8L90, and it's fully networked. What that means is we're not running an over-the-counter GM performance harness with a 4-speed transmission. We're running a full GM production harness, TCM, ECM. We're using our MoCAN module as the body control module. We have tap shift, we have cruise control, we have full air conditioning control. That includes automatic air is supported. And this is all being run right through the GM computer. So that means our AC idle bump, evaporator, temperature, our condenser pressure, fan speed control are all run right through the GM computer. This 8-speed transmission is shifting awesome. What prompted me to do the video was this customer has put several thousand miles on this Jeep. He's been all around the West Coast camping and whatever, and he brought it back for his service, oil change, and some firmware upgrades. And when I got into it and drove it, I was just amazed how good it runs, how good it shifts. The torque is just amazing. Look at this. I literally just touched the throttle, the cam comes in, and the flip side is you come to a stop and it just sits there and ticks over at 550 RPM. Basically, the LT1 is the passenger car version of the L86. The L86 is the truck motor. The LT1 has a much shorter intake and is tuned more for top-end power, where the truck is tuned more for low-end torque. And I can tell you that this LT1 has a ton of low-end torque. Just touching the throttle at any RPM and pretty much any gear, and instantly this thing launches. The transmission shifts extremely smooth. This engine does have a 4-cylinder mode, which means it goes from a 8-cylinder to a 4-cylinder. It's called Airfield Management or displacement on demand. It does that by using a lifter manifold assembly that displaces a pin in the lifter, and that allows the lifter to collapse and then that cylinder to turn into an air spring. This engine has continuous variable valve timing, which is really big because what that does is it allows us to bring the cylinder pressure to the RPM wherever we want it. Rather than having to bring the RPM to get it into its power band, we're using the camshaft to phase and bring the cylinder pressure to where we want to deliver the power and the torque. This 8-speed is a dream. It's almost like a 1-speed. It shifts so smooth. It really is starting to show the advantages that the Gen 5s have over the other engines out there. And I'm not just talking about the LSs, but I'm talking about Hemis and superchargers. Here we have an engine that's running on over 11-to-1 compression with continuous VVT and economy numbers that match the low performance engines of just a few years ago. It really is a magical combination. And this 8-speed I have not really been a big fan of because I think they're not well understood. When this 8-speed is working properly, it's an amazing transmission. You have a 4.6 low, so you can launch out of the hole on 40s with ease, and at the same time cruise on the freeway well under 2,000 RPM at 70. So we can take this 6.2 engine and turn it into a 3.1 at will. Now I'm sitting here at a stop in traffic. It's almost 100 degrees out. The air conditioning's on, and when that compressor engages and disengages, the idle bump is controlled by the GM computer. The fan is being spun up and spun down by the GM computer, not only for condenser pressure, but also for engine coolant temperature, trans temp, etc., as we've talked about before. We have full emissions in this, including evap emissions, which means you're never going to smell any fuel. As you can see, ambient's about 100 degrees, and we're running at 212 degrees. This fan isn't going to really wind up till you hit 220, 225. There's no reason to wind it up until then. We don't run the fan on full speed. We don't run the fan on half speed. We basically let the computer decide how much it wants to control the fan. We are running a variable displacement compressor, so the computer can control the output of the compressor based on the need. But what I can tell you is the 8L90 along with this Gen 5 engine is really a different experience. The torque that this engine puts out combined with the gearing of the 8L90 just feels different. Here we are the next morning. I never really test drove this LT1 because we had another L86 and a Gen 4 done at the same time, and we took them to the mountain simultaneously. But now that I got in it, I'm a little bit blown away by how well this thing runs. The docile nature of this engine, just sitting here and idling at just over 500 RPM, gives no clue to the power of this engine. The torque right off idle is amazing. Just the littlest throttle movement, and this heavy four-door JK moves like it was a sports car. So Gen 5s are becoming more viable in engine conversions. The aftermarket is catching up supporting this engine. It's a phenomenal engine. Guys are getting over 1,000 horsepower out of these engines. There has not been a whole lot of development putting a production fully networked LT engine into a conversion. In fact, I think we're the first ones to do it. And as far as I know, this is the first LT1 that's fully networked, and we did this swap a while back. But it runs just amazing. With the 4-cylinder mode active on this Jeep, I would venture to say that we're going to be getting in the high teens. I don't know. I'll talk to the customer and see what he's been getting, but that would be my guess. So let's talk a little bit about the technology of the Gen 5 motors. First, we have direct injection. Most of you know what that means. We're putting fuel right into the combustion chamber instead of the back side of the valve on the intake. And that solves a lot of problems. It allows us to run a higher compression, more efficient combustion. There's problems associated with direct injection, but it looks like GM for the most part has it sorted. So the next thing we'll look at is continuous variable valve timing, and I really believe this is the big one. What continuous variable valve timing does is it allows us to face the cam wherever we want. In the old days, and I sure talk a lot about the old days because I came from back then, when we put a camshaft in an engine, we had to pick a profile. GM runs a single camshaft overhead valve, which means basically your intake and exhaust lobes are slaved together. It's not a dual cam where you can have different intake and exhaust profiles. It's not a dual overhead cam or even a dual concentric cam. Yes, GM did play around with doing dual cams in the LT, but it was deemed to be too complicated and it lengthened the engine. So basically, when you have a cam profile, what we want to do is we want to get as much air fuel into the chamber as possible for the best power, but there's a lot of limiters to that. We need drivability. I just kicked into a 4-cylinder, so I'm cruising up the parkway in 7th gear as a 4-cylinder. So during the intake stroke, we open the intake valve up as the piston starts going down. If you close the valve at the very bottom, you might be losing some horsepower, and the reason is the momentum of the incoming column of air actually carries through even after the piston starts coming up. So a lot of high performance cams would have late intake valve closing. What this would do is allow that column of air to get rammed in even when the piston was coming back up. So at high RPM you could close the valve and actually bring more air into the engine than if you had closed the valve at the bottom. They used to call them emissions cams in the 70s. Late intake valve closing went away because at low RPM, when the piston starts coming up, you don't have the momentum of that column of air rushing in. It would blow the intake charge back into the intake manifold. That would lower the intake manifold vacuum, and that's when you would start getting the rough running, the rump, and that would of course lead to higher emissions. So roller cams became popular in the 1980s, and what roller cams offered was we were able to get more area under the curve by increasing the steepness of the ramps. If we made the ramps too steep with a flat tappet, that would reduce the life of the camshaft because you're accelerating and decelerating this lifter, and especially with high performance applications with stiff valve springs, that would wipe a cam out. By going to a roller lifter, we now could increase the steepness of the ramp, and we could get more area under the curve, and we could then bring more air fuel in by basically using a roller cam profile. And the longevity of the roller cams turned out to be really good, and almost all production engines today have roller cams. So what it's all about is getting as much air fuel into the chamber as you can get, but you're pretty much limited with a single profile cam. With a single profile cam that does not have variable valve timing, it is what it is. You have the torque you have on the bottom, you have the power you have on the top, and that's it. If you want more top end power, you want to retard the cam. If you want to increase bottom end torque, you advance the cam. So you had to pick a profile that was a compromise between the two. In the 80s and 90s, VVT became popular. Toyota, Honda, a lot of manufacturers went to a discrete VVT, or variable valve timing, that basically had two positions for the cam, parked and open. So by phasing the cam in two positions, we could have better bottom end power and better top end power. Some of the original setups were pretty crude. I remember the Toyotas, the MR2s, when they hit about 4,000 RPM, they just flatten out, bog out, and then that cam would phase and you get a burst of power again. So the power delivery wasn't exactly smooth. but it was there. Of course, if we could put that cam wherever we want, whenever we want, is the way to go. It's called continuous variable valve timing. That means even at low RPM, when you're under a high load, you can phase the cam, bring that cylinder pressure up, and get the benefit of essentially a different cam profile. It's not a different cam profile, you're just presenting it at a different position. And it really, really works well. You can feel in these LT engines, and this is probably the biggest difference that I notice, when you're at low RPM and you give it throttle, rather than the engine downshift to get into its power band, you can feel the cam phase and you get this burst of power, and you just accelerate out in the same gear. So Airfield Management, we've talked about it several times, basically takes your V8 and turns it into a 4-cylinder. Now you can't stop the pistons from moving, but you can stop the valve lifters from moving. So there's still a little bit of loss there. So we reduce what's called pumping losses, and you really see that mileage jump up when you go into a 4-cylinder mode. The problem is, in a heavy JK, you're not going to be in AFM a lot because Airfield Management doesn't have the torque to move the vehicle if it's heavy or is under a load, so it has to kick back into the V8 mode. So you can see right now I'm in a 4-cylinder mode going just about 50 miles an hour in 7th gear, and that's another thing with the 8-speed, is it can put you into your power band a little bit more efficiently so that you can stay in AFM longer. And this is kind of a complex theory that I'm trying to get across here, but the bottom line is the technology of the Gen 5 engine lends itself well to AFM because, one, we're building tremendous torque on the bottom end with the CVVT and the high compression. What that means is when we cut the cylinders in half from 8 cylinders to 4, we have a lot more torque available to us than we had the earlier engines. Remember, the earlier engines could only phase the cam at a particular RPM or a particular load value. These engines can phase the cam in 4-cylinder mode, get more torque, and stay in AFM 4-cylinder mode longer, especially when you combine that with the direct injection and the high compression. So what I'm noticing is these Gen 5 motors can actually use Airfield Management mode in moderately heavy vehicles. Now, it's still not going to do you a whole lot of good in a heavy vehicle. It's probably best just to disable it if you want to. But in a light or a medium duty vehicle, or you're looking for emissions compliance, you're going to have to leave AFM active. Here you go, guys. 70 miles an hour, 8th gear on the highway, 1700 RPM, and we're in 4-cylinder mode.